I never thought I'd be the guy to say this, but my best friend, Jake, was trying to steal my wife. And the craziest part? It worked. Looking back, there were red flags everywhere, but I was too blind, or maybe too trusting, to see them. Jake was the kind of friend you just didn't question. He was funny, reliable, and had been there for me through thick and thin. So when things started going sideways, I chalked it up to stress, my imagination, anything but the truth. It all started about a year ago when my wife, Sarah, and I hit a rough patch. Nothing too serious, just the usual stuff: work stress, different schedules, drifting apart a little. You know, married life. I figured it was just something we had to ride out. We'd been together for years, and I always believed we'd get through anything. But Jake? He seemed to be around a lot more than usual during that time, offering to hang out, help out, or just be there. And, well, I appreciated it. At first, I was glad he was around. Jake had this way of lightening the mood, and when things were tense between Sarah and me, he'd swoop in with some dumb joke or a story from our college days to break the tension. It worked, at least, I thought it did. Sarah seemed to relax around him, and I figured that was a good thing. She liked Jake, I liked Jake, so why would I ever think something was off? The first time I noticed anything strange was during a casual game night we had at our place. Jake, Sarah, and a few other friends came over. It was the usual group, but I couldn't help but feel like Jake and Sarah were close. Not in an obvious, they're totally into each other way, but in the subtle, quiet way that only someone in the middle of the situation would ignore. At one point, I went to grab drinks from the kitchen, and when I came back, they were laughing together in that way you laugh when you're in on some inside joke. I didn't think too much of it, but it did plant the seed in my head. It wasn't jealousy, at least not at first. It was more like confusion. When did they get so chummy? I brushed it off, not wanting to seem paranoid. But as the weeks went by, I started noticing it more. Jake would text Sarah sometimes, which wasn't unusual because we were all friends. But it started happening more often. At first, it was about random stuff: movies, memes, whatever. But then they'd talk about more personal things, like Sarah's job and how she was feeling overwhelmed. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Why was she talking to Jake about her feelings instead of me? Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to come off like one of those overprotective husbands who freaks out because his wife has guy friends. And besides, Jake was my best friend. There was no way he'd ever cross that line, right? One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find Jake at our place again. Sarah was sitting on the couch, laughing at something Jake had said, and they both looked up when I walked in. "Hey, man," Jake said, acting like it was no big deal. "I thought I'd stop by and see how you guys were doing. Sarah mentioned you had a tough day." I didn't even know Sarah had been texting him about me, but again, I shrugged it off. I wasn't in the mood to make a scene. So, I sat down with them and tried to get into the conversation, but it felt like I was an outsider looking in on something I wasn't really part of. Jake and Sarah had this rhythm, this easy way of talking, that I couldn't quite match. It was unsettling. That night, after Jake left, I asked Sarah about it. Nothing accusatory, just a casual, "Hey, you and Jake seem to be talking a lot lately. Everything cool?" She smiled at me, almost like I was being ridiculous. "Yeah, of course. He's just trying to help. He knows we've been going through some stuff, and he's been a good listener." That answer made sense. I mean, Jake was a good friend. He probably saw how stressed we were and wanted to help. But something still didn't sit right with me. I didn't push it, though. I didn't want to make Sarah feel like I didn't trust her, or him, for that matter. But that seed of doubt kept growing. Little things started to bother me. Like how Jake always seemed to know what was going on with Sarah, sometimes before I did. Or how she would light up when he came around, in a way that was different from how she was with me. It wasn't just that they were close, it was like they were forming their own little world, and I was on the outside, watching. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. Jake had been hanging around more than usual, and I was getting frustrated. So, I told Sarah that maybe we needed some space from him, just to focus on us for a bit. I thought she'd agree, but instead, she got defensive. Why? Jake hasn't done anything wrong. He's been a good friend, helping us through this. Helping us? I wasn't sure what to say. From my perspective, it felt like Jake was helping himself to my wife's time and attention. But saying that out loud made me sound crazy, even to myself. So, I let it go. I kept telling myself that I was just imagining things. That there was no way Jake, my best friend, would do something like that. And there was no way Sarah would fall for it, even if he did. But deep down, I knew something was off. It wasn't long after that when things really started to spiral. Sarah began spending more time running errands or meeting up with friends, but when I'd ask who she was with, her answers got vague. She'd say it was some girl from work or an old college friend, but she'd never give names or details. And when I'd press her, she'd snap at me, saying I was being paranoid and overthinking everything. I didn't want to believe what was happening. I didn't want to think that Jake would betray me like that, or that Sarah would go along with it. But all the signs were there, and I was the idiot who kept ignoring them. Things really took a turn for the worse one weekend when Sarah told me she was heading out for a girls' night. Nothing unusual, right? Except this time, something didn't add up. She had just worked a crazy long week, and normally, she'd be too tired to do much of anything on a Friday night. But here she was, suddenly full of energy and eager to go out with her friends. And the kicker? She didn't even mention which friends. I tried not to overthink it. I didn't want to be the controlling husband, checking up on her every move. But as the hours passed and she wasn't answering my texts, I couldn't help it. My mind started racing, all the little suspicions bubbling up to the surface. I mean, it wasn't like her to go completely off the grid. I kept telling myself she was just out having fun and would text me when she got the chance. But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Jake. He picked up on the third ring, sounding like he was out somewhere, too. Hey, man, what's up? I tried to keep my voice casual. Not much. Just wondering if you've heard from Sarah tonight? She's out with some friends, but she hasn't been answering her phone. There was a slight pause before Jake replied. Nah, I haven't heard from her. I'm sure she's just having a good time, though. You know how it is. Something about the way he said it set off alarm bells in my head, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I thanked him and hung up, but the doubt kept gnawing at me. Jake's tone had been off, almost like he was covering something up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something big. I tried to distract myself, flipping through TV channels and scrolling through my phone, but I couldn't focus on anything. Eventually, I dozed off on the couch, hoping I was just being paranoid and that Sarah would come home soon. When I woke up, it was almost 3 a.m. Sarah still wasn't home. Now, I was fully panicking. I called her again, straight to voicemail. I sent her a few more texts, trying to keep it cool but failing miserably. Finally, I decided to drive around, checking a few of the spots where she and her friends liked to hang out. But every place I went to was either closing or empty, and there was no sign of her. I was about to head back home when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. Sorry, out late. Crashing at a friend's place. Talk tomorrow. That was it. No explanation, no details, just a short, dismissive message that only made me feel worse. I sat in my car for a few minutes, staring at the screen. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. The next morning, Sarah came home like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, made some coffee, and acted like staying out all night without a word was no big deal. I didn't want to come off as accusatory, so I kept my questions light. How was your night? I asked, trying to sound casual. It was fun, she said, not really elaborating. We just hung out, had some drinks, you know. I nodded, but her vague answers weren't cutting it. I had to know. So, where did you end up crashing? Sarah paused for a moment, then said, Oh, at Jen's place. You don't know her. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying, but I didn't want to push her too hard. Not yet. Instead, I decided to do some digging of my own. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to her behavior. I noticed she was texting Jake more frequently, and their conversations seemed different. Less casual, more private. They'd be chatting away, and as soon as I walked into the room, Sarah would lock her phone and change the subject. I wasn't imagining it anymore. Something was going on, and I had to figure out what. One night, I decided to check her phone while she was in the shower. I know, it's a total breach of trust, but I was desperate. I needed answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake was involved somehow, but I didn't have any proof. My hands were shaking as I unlocked her phone and scrolled through her messages. At first, everything seemed normal, just the usual back and forth with friends and family. But when I got to her texts with Jake, my stomach dropped. There were messages about meeting up, but not in a casual, hey, let's grab a beer kind of way. It was more like they had been sneaking around, arranging times to see each other without me knowing. There was one message in particular that made my blood run cold. It was from Sarah, sent late at night after one of those so-called girls' nights. I can't stop thinking about you. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. This was it. The confirmation I had been dreading. Sarah wasn't just talking to Jake behind my back, she was falling for him. Or maybe she already had. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to throw the evidence in her face and demand answers. But another part of me, maybe the part that was still in shock, decided to wait. I needed more information. I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went before I could take action. The next few days were torture. Every time I looked at Sarah, all I could think about was that message. I kept waiting for the right moment to bring it up, but every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. How do you even start that conversation? Then one evening, Jake showed up at our place unannounced, as if nothing was wrong. He walked in with that easy grin of his, like he hadn't been texting my wife about God knows what behind my back. Sarah seemed tense, but she played along, acting like everything was normal. I couldn't take it anymore. As Jake sat down on the couch and started talking about his day, I snapped. Jake, can I talk to you outside for a second? Jake looked a bit surprised, but he shrugged and followed me outside. My heart was pounding as I tried to keep my cool. Confronting your best friend about something like this isn't exactly in the friendship handbook, and I wasn't sure how I was going to start this conversation without immediately losing my temper. Once we were outside, I shut the door behind me and turned to face him. Jake had this calm, almost cocky expression on his face, like he had no clue why I was even upset. That only made me angrier. So, what's going on with you and Sarah? I asked, my voice as steady as I could manage. He blinked, taken aback by the directness. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean, Jake, I said, my patience wearing thin. I've seen the texts. I know you two have been meeting up without telling me. And I saw that message she sent you. For a split second, I saw something flicker in his eyes, guilt, maybe, but he quickly composed himself. Whoa, man, you're getting the wrong idea, Jake said, raising his hands in defense. Sarah and I are just friends. You know that. She's been going through a tough time, and I've been there to talk to her. That's all. I can't stop thinking about you doesn't sound like a casual friendship, Jake, I shot back. What the hell is going on? Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Okay, yeah, I get why that looks bad, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. Sarah's been feeling distant from you lately, and she needed someone to talk to. She didn't feel like she could come to you, so she came to me. That's it. His words stung, even though they were meant to sound reassuring. The idea that my wife felt like she couldn't talk to me but could confide in Jake, my best friend, made me feel like a failure. But I wasn't buying his excuse. Something was still off. Look, I care about both of you, Jake continued. I would never cross that line. I'm just trying to help you guys work through whatever you're going through. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But after everything I had seen, how could I? There was a part of me that still trusted Jake, But another part of me couldn't ignore the evidence staring me in the face. Then explain why you two have been sneaking around behind my back, I said, my voice hard. Why didn't either of you tell me what was going on? Jake's expression shifted, like he was getting frustrated. Because you're being paranoid, man. We didn't tell you because we knew you'd react like this. You're seeing things that aren't there. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my temper in check. So, you're saying I'm imagining all of this? That I'm just making it up in my head? Jake hesitated for a moment, then sighed again. Look, I get that this is a lot to process. But nothing's happened. I swear. Sarah loves you. She's just confused right now. But you two can work through it. I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth or just a really good liar. Either way, the damage was done. Even if nothing physical had happened between them yet, the emotional betrayal was enough. Sarah had chosen Jake over me, even if it was just to confide in him. And that hurt more than I could put into words. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. All right. But if I find out you're lying to me, Jake, we're done. Jake looked at me, a mixture of relief and something else, guilt, in his eyes. I get it, man. I really do. But I'm not lying. We stood there in awkward silence for a few seconds before I turned and walked back inside. I didn't want to be around Jake anymore. I didn't even want to see Sarah right now, but I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. When I went back inside, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with concern. What did you guys talk about? She asked, her voice small. I sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. I talked to Jake about what's been going on. I know you've been texting him a lot and meeting up without telling me. Her face paled, and she glanced down at her hands. I didn't want to hurt you, she said softly. I just felt like I couldn't talk to you about everything. You've been so stressed with work, and I didn't want to add to it. I felt a lump form in my throat. So you talked to Jake instead? She nodded, looking ashamed. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't mean to hurt you, but Jake was just there. And he listened. I rubbed my face with my hands, feeling the weight of her words. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand why she hadn't come to me. But I already knew the answer. Somewhere along the way, we had drifted apart, and she had found comfort in someone else, someone I had trusted with everything. So what now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know, she said honestly. I still love you, but I feel so confused. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, to fix whatever had gone wrong. But another part of me wasn't sure if there was anything left to fix. If she couldn't come to me when things got tough, what kind of relationship did we really have? We sat there in silence for what felt like forever, neither of us knowing what to say or do. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavy in the air, and I wasn't sure if we could ever come back from this. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and forced small talk. It felt like Sarah and I were walking on eggshells around each other, both afraid to address the elephant in the room but also unsure of how to move forward. The tension was unbearable. Every time I saw her glance at her phone, my stomach twisted, wondering if she was texting Jake again. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I had to confront the situation head-on, even if it meant getting answers I didn't want to hear. So one evening, I sat Sarah down at the kitchen table, determined to have the conversation we'd both been avoiding. We need to talk, I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. Sarah looked at me, her expression already tense. She knew this was coming. Yeah, we do. I took a deep breath. I need to know where we stand, Sarah. Are you still, talking to Jake? She bit her lip, glancing down at the table before looking back at me. We've talked, but not like before. After you confronted him, things changed. I told him I needed some space to figure things out. I wanted to feel relieved, but her hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Jake might have been out of the picture for now, but the damage was done. She had already emotionally checked out of our relationship, and I wasn't sure how or if we could fix that. "Do you still have feelings for him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt like a knife twisting in my gut to even ask, but I needed to hear it from her. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at her hands, her fingers nervously picking at her nails. "I don't know," she finally said. "I'm confused. I never meant for any of this to happen, but I can't pretend like I don't feel something for him." That was it. The confirmation I had been dreading. My best friend had successfully wormed his way into my wife's heart, and I had been too blind to stop it before it was too late. I felt a wave of anger surge through me, but I fought to keep it under control. Blowing up wouldn't solve anything. "So what does that mean for us?" I asked, my voice shaking. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt and sadness. "I don't know. I still love you, but I need time to figure things out." "Figure things out?" I echoed, my frustration starting to show. "Sarah, we're married. This isn't some high school relationship where you can just figure things out. You either want to be with me or you don't." She wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice cracking. "I know, but I don't want to make any rash decisions. I need space to think." Space. That word made me want to scream. It was the go-to excuse when someone didn't want to face the reality of a situation. But what could I do? I couldn't force her to stay, and I didn't want to be the guy who clung on to a marriage that was already falling apart. "Fine," I said after a long pause. "Take the space you need. But don't expect me to just sit here and wait forever while you decide whether or not you still want this." She nodded, her face crumpling as she started to cry. I hated seeing her like this, but I couldn't ignore the fact that she had put us in this situation. If she had come to me instead of Jake, maybe things would have turned out differently. But now? I wasn't so sure. That night, I slept on the couch. It was the first time since we got married that we hadn't shared a bed, and the loneliness hit me like a ton of bricks. I stared up at the ceiling for hours, wondering how things had gone so wrong so quickly. My mind raced with memories of better times, back when Sarah and I were inseparable, before Jake became a wedge between us. The next morning, Sarah told me she was going to stay with her sister for a while. "Just until I can clear my head," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. I didn't fight her on it. What was the point? I wasn't going to beg her to stay if she felt like she needed to leave. So I just nodded, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Do what you have to do." She packed a small bag and left within the hour. The house felt eerily quiet after she was gone, like a hollow shell of what it used to be. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, half expecting her to walk back in and tell me she'd changed her mind. But she didn't. For the next few days, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the crushing reality that my marriage was falling apart. I avoided Jake, ignored his texts, and kept my distance from everyone. I didn't want to talk about it. Hell, I didn't even know what to say. Then one afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but for some reason, I picked up. "Hello? Hey, man, it's Jake." I froze. Of course, it was him. "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end before Jake spoke again, his voice low and serious. "We need to talk. I know you're pissed at me, and you have every right to be. But I swear, I never meant for any of this to happen." I felt a surge of anger flare up. "Really, Jake? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you went out of your way to get close to Sarah. You knew we were having problems, and instead of being my friend, you swooped in and made things worse." He sighed. "Look, I don't blame you for being mad. I get it. But you have to believe me when I say I didn't plan this. It just happened." "It just happened?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You don't accidentally fall in love with your best friend's wife, Jake. That's not how this works." "I know," he admitted. But it's not like I tried to steal her from you. She came to me because she needed someone to talk to, and things got out of hand. I never wanted it to go this far. I was done with his excuses. You know what, Jake? I don't care anymore. You can say whatever you want to justify what you did, but the fact is, you betrayed me. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he'd hung up. But then he spoke again, his voice quiet. I get it, man. I really do. I wish things had turned out differently. Yeah, I said bitterly. Me too. I hung up without saying anything else, my hands trembling with anger. Talking to Jake had only made me feel worse. He had been my best friend for years, and now he was the reason my marriage was falling apart. How do you even begin to process something like that? After that call with Jake, I was done. I didn't want to hear any more excuses, any more half-baked apologies. The trust was shattered, and there was no way to fix it. My best friend had crossed a line, and my wife had let him. I was stuck between two people who had both broken something that felt impossible to repair. Sarah hadn't come home yet, and her silence only made things worse. Every day I hoped for a text, a call, something, anything that would signal she still cared enough to try and fix this. But nothing came. It was like she had just vanished, leaving me to drown in the mess she'd helped create. I finally broke down one night after a couple of beers, sitting alone in our living room, staring at old photos of us. There was this one picture from a trip we took to the mountains, where Sarah was laughing, her arms wrapped around me. We both looked so happy, like we were invincible. I couldn't reconcile that version of her with the person who had just walked out on our marriage without even fighting for it. I grabbed my phone, my fingers hovering over her contact, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? Beg her to come home? Ask her if she had made up her mind yet? I felt pathetic just thinking about it. So instead, I tossed my phone on the couch and cracked open another beer, letting the bitterness settle in. A few more days passed, and still no word from Sarah. I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I had to know what was going on, even if the answer wasn't what I wanted to hear. So, I made the decision to go to her sister's house. When I got there, I sat in my car for a good 10 minutes, debating whether or not I should even go inside. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to pretend like this whole mess wasn't happening. But I couldn't live in limbo anymore. I needed answers. I walked up to the door and knocked. Sarah's sister, Emma, answered, looking a little surprised to see me. Hey, is Sarah here? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Emma nodded but looked hesitant. Yeah, she's here. I'll get her. She disappeared inside, and a few moments later, Sarah appeared at the door. She looked tired, like she hadn't been sleeping well, and her expression was a mix of guilt and sadness. Seeing her like that made my heart ache, but it didn't change the fact that we needed to have this conversation. Can we talk? I asked, gesturing toward the driveway. Sarah nodded and followed me outside. We stood there for a moment in awkward silence, neither of us knowing how to start. Finally, I took a deep breath and broke the ice. So, what's going on, Sarah? You've been gone for over a week, and I feel like I'm losing my mind over here. I need to know where your head's at. She looked down at the ground, avoiding my eyes. I've been trying to figure that out too, she admitted. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, but everything's just so messed up. I felt my frustration rising again. I get that, but you can't just leave me hanging like this. I need to know if you still want this, if you still want us. Sarah finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. I don't know, she said, her voice cracking. I love you, but I don't know if that's enough anymore. Things haven't been the same between us for a while, and I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until Jake. Hearing her say his name made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. So what are you saying? You're in love with Jake now? She shook her head quickly. No. It's not like that. I don't even know what I feel for him. It was just a distraction. Something that made me feel less alone when we were drifting apart. But I never meant to hurt you like this. I rubbed my temples, trying to process everything. So what do we do now? Are you saying you want a divorce? Sarah's face crumpled, and she started crying. I don't know. I don't want to throw everything away, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to come back from what's happened. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had hoped she'd be ready to fight for our marriage, to put in the work to rebuild what we had lost. But now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe the damage was too deep. I can't do this on my own, Sarah, I said quietly. If you don't want to be with me, just say it. Don't drag this out any longer than it needs to be. She wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. I don't want to lose you, but I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not. I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. So where does that leave us? Sarah hesitated, then looked up at me with sad eyes. I think we need some time apart. For real this time. No half measures. We both need to figure out what we really want before we can decide if we have a future together. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I had been bracing for this, but hearing her actually say it was still like a knife to the chest. How long are we talking? I don't know, she admitted. But I think it's the only way we can figure out if we're meant to be together or if we're just holding on to something that's already gone. I wanted to argue, to tell her we could work things out without separating, but deep down, I knew she was right. We had both been stuck in this limbo, neither of us willing to face the reality of how far apart we had drifted. Okay, I said, my voice hollow. If that's what you need, then I'll give you the space. But I'm not going to wait forever, Sarah. If you walk away, you need to know that I might not be here when you come back. She looked like she was about to say something, but then she just nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand. Without another word, I turned and walked back to my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. The days following our conversation felt like walking through a fog. Everything seemed distant and unreal, like I was watching my life unravel from a distance. Sarah had officially moved in with her sister for the time being, leaving our house cold and empty. Every room reminded me of her, of us, and what we used to have. But now, it all felt like a distant memory. I tried keeping myself busy, focusing on work, but nothing seemed to help. The silence in the house was unbearable. I'd find myself staring at my phone, wondering if Sarah would text or call, but each time the screen stayed blank. I thought about Jake too. I still hadn't talked to him since that call, and honestly, I didn't plan on it. He'd crossed a line that I couldn't forgive. The guy who used to be my best friend was now a ghost, haunting my thoughts, reminding me of how everything had gone sideways. One afternoon, out of nowhere, I got a text from an old high school buddy, Mike. We hadn't talked in a while, but he'd heard through the grapevine that things were rough between Sarah and me. He suggested we grab a beer, catch up, and talk it out. Normally, I declined, but at that moment, I needed any kind of distraction. Mike and I met up at this old dive bar we used to go to back in the day. It felt good to be out of the house, away from the suffocating silence, even if I wasn't in the best headspace. We ordered a couple of beers and settled into one of the worn-out booths, the sound of pool tables and low chatter filling the background. So, man, Mike said after a few sips. What's been going on with you? Heard you and Sarah are having a rough time. I sighed, staring down at my beer. Yeah, that's one way to put it. Things have been complicated. Mike nodded, giving me that look like he understood, even if he didn't know all the details. I get it. Relationships are tough, man. My ex and I went through hell before we finally split. I winced at the word split. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but I knew Mike was just being honest. I don't know if we're there yet, I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. She's staying with her sister for now. We're taking some time apart to figure things out. That's rough, Mike said, taking another sip of his beer. But hey, maybe some space is what you both need. Sometimes being apart helps you see things more clearly, you know? Yeah, maybe, I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. Every day without her felt like I was losing her more and more. We spent the next hour catching up on life, reminiscing about old times, and for a while, it almost felt like things were normal again. But that nagging weight in my chest never really went away. No matter how many beers I had or how many jokes Mike cracked, the reality of my situation was always there, lurking in the background. As the night went on, Mike's advice got a little looser, a little more alcohol-fueled. You know, man, he said, leaning in, you can't let her hold all the power here. If she's out there figuring out what she wants, maybe you should do the same. Don't just sit around waiting for her to make a decision. I raised an eyebrow. What are you saying? I should just move on? Mike shrugged. Not saying you should rush into anything. But you deserve to be happy too. If she's not sure about you, maybe it's time you start thinking about what makes you happy, you know? I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to argue that I wasn't ready to give up on Sarah, that I still wanted to fix things. But another part of me, a part that had been growing louder with each passing day, wondered if Mike was right. How long was I supposed to wait for Sarah to figure out if she still wanted to be with me? And what if, in the end, she didn't? The idea of moving on felt impossible, but I couldn't deny that the thought had crossed my mind. I'd spent so much energy trying to hold on to something that might already be broken beyond repair. Maybe it was time to focus on myself for a change. A few days later, I got an unexpected text from Sarah. Seeing her name pop up on my phone made my heart skip a beat, but I quickly realized it wasn't the kind of message I'd been hoping for. Sarah, can we talk this weekend? I think we need to have a real conversation about where we go from here. That was it. No, I miss you, no, how are you? Just straight to the point. I stared at the screen for a minute, a knot forming in my stomach. This wasn't going to be good. I texted her back, agreeing to meet up, and spent the next few days mentally preparing myself for whatever she had to say. I tried not to get my hopes up, but part of me still clung to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she wanted to work things out. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop we used to go to. It felt strange being there, sitting across from her, like we were strangers meeting for the first time. Sarah looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup, and I could tell she had something heavy on her mind. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she began, her voice soft but steady. About us. About everything. I braced myself, trying to keep my expression neutral. And? Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine. I think we need to let each other go. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs as I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. I love you, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. But I don't think we can go back to the way things were. Too much has happened. We've hurt each other, and I don't know if we can ever really fix that. I wanted to argue, to tell her we could work through it if we tried hard enough. But deep down, I knew she was right. Things hadn't been the same for a long time, and as much as I didn't want to admit it, maybe we were holding on to something that was already gone. So, this is it? I asked, my voice hoarse. Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I think it's for the best. For both of us. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, both of us grappling with the reality of what was happening. This was the end. There was no going back now. Eventually, Sarah stood up, wiping her eyes. I'll come by the house this weekend to get my things. I'll be out of your way soon. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As she walked out of the coffee shop, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. It was over. After everything we'd been through, after all the pain and heartache, it was finally over. But as I sat there, alone with my thoughts, I realized that maybe this was a new beginning. Maybe, just maybe, I could start to rebuild my life without the weight of the past dragging me down. The weekend rolled around, and just as Sarah had said, she came by to get her things. I made sure to be out of the house when she came. I couldn't handle watching her pack up our life together. The thought of seeing her go through our closet, deciding which pieces of our shared existence to take and which to leave behind, was too much. When I got home later that evening, the house felt different. Emptier. Her absence was tangible in the space, like the air had shifted in a way that made it hard to breathe. Her side of the closet was bare, her toothbrush gone from the bathroom, and the few photos of us together that used to be scattered around the house had disappeared too. It was like she was erasing herself from my life, leaving nothing but the memories behind. I should have been angry. I should have been heartbroken. But mostly, I just felt numb. Like I was floating through my own life, detached from everything happening around me. Maybe it hadn't fully hit me yet. Maybe I was still in shock. All I knew was that things would never be the same again. A couple of days later, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through social media, when I saw something that made my stomach turn. There it was, clear as day, a picture of Jake and Sarah. Together. They were at some bar, smiling and laughing like everything was normal. Like they hadn't just blown up my life. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. I felt a mix of rage and betrayal boil up inside me. How could they be so casual about it? So public? It hadn't even been that long since we decided to end things, and here they were, flaunting whatever the hell this was in front of everyone. I didn't know if they were officially together, but seeing them like that, all cozy and carefree, sent me spiraling. It felt like confirmation that this whole thing between them wasn't just a stupid mistake. Maybe it never was. Maybe it had been going on longer than I realized, behind my back, while I was still fighting for my marriage. I threw my phone across the room, watching it bounce off the couch and onto the floor. My chest heaved as I sat there, trying to calm down, trying not to let the anger consume me. But it was no use. Everything came crashing down all at once: Jake's betrayal, Sarah's indecision, the end of my marriage. It was too much. I grabbed my jacket and stormed out of the house, needing to get away, needing to clear my head. I ended up at the same dive bar Mike and I had gone to the other night. The place was dark, noisy, and exactly what I needed. I ordered a drink and found a corner to sit in, trying to drown out the noise in my head with the chatter and clinking of glasses around me. As I sat there, nursing my drink, my mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of confrontation. I wanted to text Jake, call him out for what he'd done, make him feel as miserable as I felt. I wanted to scream at Sarah, ask her how she could move on so quickly, how she could do this to me. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make me feel any better. If anything, it would just drag me deeper into the mess I was already in. So, I did nothing. I just sat there, letting the alcohol numb the pain, letting the noise of the bar drown out my thoughts. Maybe this was my new normal, floating through life, disconnected, trying to forget everything that had happened. The next few days blurred together. I went to work, came home, tried to fill the empty hours with anything that would keep me distracted. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling of loss that weighed me down. It was like a constant ache, a reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. One afternoon, while I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I got a message from Mike. Mike, hey man, how you holding up? I stared at the message for a minute before typing a half-hearted reply. Me, been better. Mike didn't press for details, which I appreciated. Instead, he sent me an invite to a party he was throwing that weekend. Just a small gathering, he said. Good people, good vibes. Come hang out. Normally, I would have declined. I wasn't really in the mood to socialize, to put on a happy face and pretend everything was fine. But part of me knew that sitting around and stewing in my misery wasn't doing me any favors either. Maybe being around people, even just for a few hours, would help me feel a little more normal. When the weekend came, I reluctantly agreed to go. The party was at Mike's place, a small but cozy apartment that always seemed to be full of people. As soon as I walked in, I was greeted by the smell of pizza and the sound of laughter. It was a stark contrast to the silence I had been living in for the past few weeks. Mike spotted me from across the room and waved me over. Glad you made it, man, he said, handing me a beer. I figured you could use a night out. I gave him a small smile. Yeah, thanks. It's good to be out. We spent the first hour or so catching up with some of Mike's friends, talking about everything except the obvious. I appreciated that no one asked about Sarah or the breakup. It was like they all knew I wasn't ready to talk about it yet. At some point during the night, I ended up outside on the balcony, looking out over the city. The cool night air felt good against my skin, and for the first time in a while, I felt a little bit of peace. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was just being around people again, but for a brief moment, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. I was lost in thought when someone stepped out onto the balcony next to me. I turned to see a woman I hadn't noticed before. She was tall, with long dark hair and a confident smile. She glanced over at me, raising an eyebrow. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. I shrugged. "Go ahead." She leaned against the railing, looking out at the city for a moment before turning back to me. "You don't look like you're having much fun," she said with a smirk. I chuckled. "Yeah, I guess I'm not really in a party mood." She tilted her head, studying me for a second. "Rough week?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You could say that." She didn't press for details, which I appreciated. Instead, she stuck out her hand. "I'm Chloe, by the way." I shook her hand, introducing myself, and we ended up talking for a while. It was easy, casual, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel like I had to put on a front. We talked about random things: work, movies, travel, nothing too deep, but it was exactly what I needed. Just a normal conversation with someone who didn't know me, didn't know my story, and didn't expect anything from me. As the night went on, I found myself actually enjoying her company. She had this laid-back vibe that made me feel comfortable, like I could just be myself without any expectations. It was a nice change of pace from the chaos my life had become. Eventually, the party started winding down, and people began heading home. Chloe and I exchanged numbers before she left, and as I watched her walk away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe things weren't as hopeless as they seemed. Maybe, despite everything that had happened, there was still a chance for something good in my life. The days after meeting Chloe felt different. For the first time in a while, I had something to look forward to that wasn't tainted by the baggage of my past. We texted back and forth, nothing serious, just casual conversations that somehow made the days a little lighter. There was no pressure, no expectations, just the simple act of getting to know someone new. It wasn't that I was ready to dive into something serious again, not even close. I was still healing, still picking up the pieces of everything that had happened with Sarah. But talking to Chloe was like a breath of fresh air. She didn't pry into my life or ask uncomfortable questions. She just seemed content to let things unfold naturally, and that was exactly what I needed. One night, she suggested we grab dinner. I hesitated at first, unsure if I was ready to step back into the dating world, but in the end, I agreed. We met at a small Italian place downtown, the kind of cozy restaurant that felt intimate without being too much. Chloe looked stunning when she walked in, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She had this effortless confidence about her, like she knew exactly who she was and wasn't afraid to show it. I admired that about her, especially after how uncertain everything had been with Sarah. We talked over wine and pasta, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Chloe had a quick wit and a dry sense of humor that kept me on my toes, and it was easy to forget, even if just for a little while, about everything that had happened. For those few hours, it was just us, two people enjoying a meal and each other's company. By the end of the night, I felt more relaxed than I had in a long time. As we walked out of the restaurant, Chloe turned to me with a smile. "I had a good time tonight," she said, her eyes glinting in the soft glow of the streetlights. "Me too," I replied, genuinely meaning it. She gave me a quick hug before we parted ways, and as I watched her walk away, I felt that flicker of hope again. Maybe things were starting to turn around. Maybe, after everything, I could actually find happiness again. But of course, life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. The next day, I was sitting at home, scrolling through my phone when I saw a message from Jake. "Jake, we need to talk. I know you're pissed at me, but there's something you should know." I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. The last thing I wanted was to talk to Jake. He'd crossed every line possible, and as far as I was concerned, he didn't deserve another chance to explain himself. but the way he phrased the message made me uneasy. There was something about it that felt off. Against my better judgment, I texted him back. "Me, what do you want, Jake?" A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. "Jake, can we meet? I'll explain everything in person." I groaned, rubbing my temples. This was the last thing I needed. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking he could fix things with a conversation. But something told me that if I didn't hear him out, I'd regret it. Reluctantly, I agreed. We met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, one of those places where no one really goes unless they're avoiding someone. It seemed fitting. When Jake walked in, he looked different. Not in a physical sense, but there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Guilt, maybe? Regret? I wasn't sure, and honestly, I didn't care. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. I didn't respond. I just sat there, waiting for him to explain himself. I wasn't here to play nice. He'd already burned that bridge. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know you don't want to hear this, and you have every right to hate me right now. But there's more to this than you think." I crossed my arms, leaning back in my seat. "Go on." He hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Sarah and we didn't plan for any of this to happen. It happened. I'm not making excuses, but you need to know that it wasn't just about her and me. She's been struggling for a long time, man. Longer than either of us realized." I frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean struggling?" Jake leaned forward, lowering his voice. "She's been seeing a therapist for months. I didn't know until recently, but she's been dealing with a lot of stuff from her past, stuff about the future. I think she's been confused about what she wants for a while now, and I think that's why things happened between us." I narrowed my eyes. "So what? You're saying this is my fault? Because I wasn't enough for her?" Jake shook his head quickly. "No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that Sarah's been going through something, and she didn't know how to talk to you about it. I don't think she knew how to deal with any of it, honestly." I clenched my fists under the table, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "So instead of talking to me, she talks to you? And now what? You two are a thing?" Jake winced, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know, man. I don't know what we are. But I'm not here to defend myself. I'm just trying to give you some context. I screwed up, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I think Sarah's been lost for a while, and maybe that's why things went the way they did." I sat there, trying to process everything he was saying. It didn't excuse what they did, not by a long shot, but it did make me see things in a different light. Sarah had always been private about certain things, but I never imagined she'd been struggling like this. "You should have told me," I finally said, my voice quiet but firm. "If you knew she was going through something, you should have told me. Instead, you made things worse." Jake nodded, his eyes full of regret. "I know. I screwed up, big time. And I'll have to live with that. I just wanted you to know that it wasn't as simple as you think. Sarah's been going through her own hell, and I don't think she even knew how to ask for help." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell him to get lost and never talk to me again. But another part of me, the part that still cared about Sarah, despite everything, wanted to understand. If she'd been struggling, if she'd been lost, maybe there was more to all of this than I realized. After a long pause, I finally spoke. "Does she know you're telling me all this?" Jake shook his head. "No. She doesn't. I figured it was something you deserved to hear, though. Even if it doesn't change anything." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know what to do with this information, Jake. It doesn't change what happened." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know the truth." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of everything hanging between us. I didn't know what to feel: anger, sadness, confusion? maybe all of it at once. But one thing was clear, nothing about this situation was simple. After a while, I stood up, sliding my jacket on. I appreciate you telling me, but I still need time to figure out how I feel about all of this. Jake nodded, standing as well. Take all the time you need, man. I get it. As I left the coffee shop, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Jake's words echoed in my head, making me question everything I thought I knew about the situation. Sarah had been struggling, and maybe that was why things had fallen apart. But it didn't erase the pain of what she and Jake had done. I walked aimlessly for a while, trying to sort through my feelings. It was hard to know what was real anymore, what had been genuine in my relationship with Sarah, and what had been a result of her internal battles. All I knew was that I needed to figure out what came next. As I walked home from the coffee shop, the weight of everything Jake had said lingered with me. It was like the final piece of a puzzle I didn't want to solve, but now I had no choice. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, my mind playing back everything from the past few months with Sarah. The little things I had ignored, the subtle shifts in her behavior, now they all seemed to make sense in a way I hadn't seen before. I woke up the next morning feeling emotionally drained. As I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, staring at the blank wall in front of me, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could keep living in the past, replaying the same painful memories, or I could finally start moving on. The problem was, I didn't know what that looked like anymore. The next couple of days were quiet. No texts from Sarah, no more unexpected messages from Jake. It was like the world had hit pause, giving me some much-needed space to breathe. I focused on work, tried to spend time with friends, and even considered calling Chloe to see if she wanted to hang out again. But I kept putting it off. Part of me wasn't sure if I was ready to get back into anything yet. Then, one evening, when I least expected it, Sarah called. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard her voice since she had come to pack her things. After everything Jake had told me, I didn't know if I was ready to talk to her, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed me to answer. Hello? Hey, her voice was soft, almost tentative. Can we talk? I hesitated, not sure if I could handle whatever conversation she was about to throw at me, but I finally said, yeah, I guess. We met at the park near our old place. It was a quiet spot we used to go to when we needed to get away from the world for a bit. Sitting there on that bench, the familiarity of the place made everything feel surreal. Sarah looked different, tired, like the weight of everything had finally caught up with her too. We sat in silence for a few moments before she finally spoke. I know I don't deserve this, she said quietly. But I need to explain myself. I owe you that much. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. I wasn't ready to let her off the hook, but I needed to hear her side of things. I've been lost for a long time, she began, her voice shaky. Even before all of this with Jake. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know what I wanted. And instead of dealing with it, I just shut down. I pushed you away because I didn't know how to handle what was going on inside me. She paused, taking a deep breath. I started seeing a therapist a few months ago, but by the time I realized how deep my issues ran, I think it was already too late. Jake. I don't even know how that happened. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about me running from my problems, using him as an escape. But I realize now that I hurt you in ways I can never take back, and I'm so sorry. I swallowed hard, trying to process her words. It was hard to reconcile this version of Sarah, the one who was broken and struggling, with the person I had loved. But the truth was, it didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. You should have come to me, I said, my voice hoarse. You should have talked to me instead of running to him. I know, she whispered. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I didn't know how to face you, how to tell you that I wasn't okay. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I couldn't. And I'm so sorry for dragging you into my mess. We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of everything hanging between us. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to let go of the anger and start fresh, but another part of me was still hurt, still struggling with the betrayal. I don't know what you expect from me, Sarah, I finally said. You broke my trust in the worst way possible. I don't know if I can just move past that. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said softly. I just wanted you to know the truth. I wanted to be honest with you, even if it's too late. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. I don't know where my life is going right now, and I know I've messed up. But I want you to know that none of this was your fault. You were a good husband. I'm the one who was broken. I sat there, staring at the ground, not knowing what to say. Everything felt so final, like the closing of a chapter one wasn't ready to finish. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this was the end, and I had to accept that. I don't hate you, I said quietly, surprising myself with the words. But I can't forget what happened. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I understand. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone on the bench, the sound of her footsteps fading into the distance. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. It was over. Whatever we had been through, it was finally over. The next few weeks were a blur. I focused on rebuilding my life, one small step at a time. I leaned on my friends more than ever, went out more, tried to find joy in the little things again. Chloe and I started hanging out more regularly, though I kept things casual. I wasn't ready for anything serious, and she seemed to understand that. One night, we were sitting on the same balcony where we'd had our first real conversation. The city lights twinkled below us, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Chloe turned to me, a playful smile on her face. You know, for someone who's been through hell, you're handling things pretty well. I chuckled, shaking my head. I don't know if I'd say that. But I'm trying. She leaned in closer, her eyes softening. That's all anyone can ask for. And in that moment, I realized she was right. Life had thrown me one hell of a curveball, but I was still standing. I was still here, still trying to figure things out, one day at a time. And maybe that was enough. As the night wore on, I found myself thinking less about the past and more about the future. I didn't know what would happen with Chloe, or where my life was heading from here, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had options. Like I could choose my path, instead of letting the past define me. And that, I realized, was the real victory.